a man rescues a tiny mud-soaked puppy from the side of a road, thinking he's just saved a helpless dog from the storm. But when he brings it home and rinses off the layers of dirt, he realizes it's not a dog at all. It's something else entirely, fragile, unexpected, and about to change his life in a way he never saw coming. What happens next isn't just about saving a life, but much more than that. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The evening air bit through Elliot Hayes' worn denim jacket as he turned the rusty key in the barn door's lock. The metal groaned, a familiar sound that had become part of his daily routine since retiring from teaching 3 years ago. Wind whistled through the gaps in the weathered boards, carrying with it the first drops of a spring drizzle. Elliot glanced up at the darkening Minnesota sky, his weathered face creasing with concern. Heavy clouds rolled overhead like waves of gray wool, promising a proper storm before morning. He tugged his jacket closer, feeling the dampness already seeping through the fabric. The peaceful solitude he'd grown accustomed to suddenly felt heavier than usual, matching the weight of the clouds above. The barn secured, he started toward his house, a modest 2-story structure that had seen better days, much like himself. The gravel crunched beneath his boots, each step automatic after countless evening walks across the same path. The wind picked up, rustling through the still bare branches of the old maple trees that lined his property. That's when he heard it. The sound was so faint he almost missed it, a weak, tremulous bleat that seemed to float on the wind. Elliot stopped mid-stride, his breath catching. For a moment, he wondered if he'd imagined it. But then it came again, barely audible over the growing whisper of rain. He turned toward the church next door, its small parking lot illuminated by a single street lamp that flickered uncertainly in the gathering gloom. Through the curtain of drizzle, movement caught his eye. A small, dark shape stumbled across the cracked asphalt, weaving unsteadily between puddles that reflected the sickly yellow light. Elliot squinted through the rain, his heart quickening as the creature's legs gave out. It collapsed beneath the street lamp with a soft thud that he felt more than heard. Without thinking, he was moving, his boots splashing through shallow puddles as he crossed the lot. "Hey there," he called softly, approaching slowly to avoid frightening what he assumed was a lost puppy. The shape didn't move, just lay there trembling in the growing rain. As he drew closer, he could see it was completely covered in mud, its form barely distinguishable under the thick coating of earth. Kneeling beside the creature, Elliot felt a familiar ache in his chest, one that reminded him of countless times he'd helped injured animals during his years of living alone on the property. The animal's breathing was shallow and rapid, its eyes barely open. Without hesitation, he shrugged off his jacket, ignoring the cold rain that immediately began soaking through his flannel shirt. "Easy now," he murmured, carefully wrapping the muddy creature in his jacket. It offered no resistance as he lifted it, feeling how light and fragile it was in his arms. "Let's get you somewhere warm." The walk back to his house seemed longer than usual, each step measured to avoid jostling his precious cargo. The porch light clicked on automatically as he approached, casting a warm glow over the peeling paint of his front door. Fumbling with his keys one-handed, he managed to get inside, kicking the door shut behind him. The kitchen had always been his favorite room in the house, with its worn but clean counters and the collection of plants Claire had started years ago, which he still tenderly maintained. He flipped on the overhead light, its warm glow chasing away the gray darkness that had followed him in. Moving with purpose now, Elliot cleared off the kitchen table with one arm, carefully shifting aside the morning's newspaper and an empty coffee mug. He laid his jacket-wrapped bundle down gently, noticing how his hands trembled as he turned to the sink. The pipes groaned briefly before warm water began flowing, steam rising in gentle curls. "Hang in there, little one," he said softly, testing the water temperature with his wrist, just as he'd done years ago when bathing his neighbor's children. The creature remained still, its breathing shallow but steady. Grabbing a clean dishcloth from the drawer, Elliot began the careful process of cleaning away the mud. He worked methodically, speaking in low, soothing tones, as he had countless times in his classroom when calming nervous students before their first chemistry experiment. "You're safe now," he assured the animal, though his voice caught slightly on the words. It had been a long time since he'd spoken to anyone other than himself in this kitchen. The mud turned the water a murky brown as he worked, revealing patches of what he assumed would be fur beneath. But as the warm water ran in rivulets through his careful fingers, something unexpected began to emerge. Instead of the soft paw pads he'd been expecting, delicate hooves appeared, small and perfectly formed, despite their obvious weakness. Elliot leaned closer, his breath catching in his throat as understanding dawned. The creature in his hands wasn't a puppy at all. As more mud washed away, the distinctive features of a baby goat became clear. The delicate slope of its face, the tiny nubs where horns would eventually grow, the spindly legs now clean enough to show their true form. The animal was severely undernourished, its ribs visible through its mud-streaked coat. As if sensing his revelation, the baby goat's eyes fluttered open briefly. Though glassy, they held a spark of awareness, meeting Elliot's gaze with an intelligence that made his heart skip a beat. "Well," he muttered, surprise evident in his voice, "what in the world?" The steady patter of rain against the windows filled the kitchen with a gentle rhythm as Elliot carefully dried the tiny goat with an old dish towel. His movements were deliberate and gentle, mindful of how fragile she seemed under his weathered hands. The cloth was functional but rough, and something about using it didn't feel right. He paused, water dripping from his rolled-up sleeves, and looked toward the hallway. Without letting himself think too hard about it, he walked to the closet near the bathroom, his footsteps echoing in the empty house. The door creaked as he opened it. He'd been meaning to oil those hinges for months now. Inside, past the stack of fresh linens and extra blankets, his hand found what he was looking for. Claire's bath towels still folded exactly as she'd left them. The pink one was on top, her favorite. She'd used it every morning, claiming it was the perfect balance of soft and absorbent. He'd teased her about being particular, but she'd just smile and say some things were worth being picky about. His fingers traced the familiar fabric. For 3 years, he'd left these towels untouched, as if moving them might erase some essential part of her presence that lingered in the house. But now, without hesitation, he pulled the pink towel free and carried it back to the kitchen. The baby goat lay quietly on the table, trembling slightly despite the warmth of the room. Elliot wrapped her in Claire's towel, and something about the sight made his throat tighten. The pink fabric seemed to swallow the tiny creature, but she snuggled into it immediately, as if recognizing its softness. "Come on, little one," he murmured, gathering the bundle carefully in his arms. "Let's get you somewhere more comfortable." The sunroom had always been Claire's favorite spot in the house. Even in winter, she'd sit there with her morning coffee, watching the birds at the feeders she'd hung outside the windows. Now, the room was dark, except for the warm glow spilling in from the kitchen and the occasional flash of lightning through the rain-streaked glass. Elliot flicked on the small lamp in the corner, casting a soft light across the worn furniture and potted plants. Fewer now than when Claire had tended them, but he'd managed to keep some alive. The old wooden rocking chair still sat in its usual spot, angled to catch the morning sun. Moving with purpose, he retrieved a large laundry basket from the utility room and began laying down layers of old bath mats and towels, creating a soft nest. The familiar motions reminded him of preparing a bed for an injured robin Claire had once found. She'd always had a way with hurt things. Once satisfied with the bedding, he gently lowered the goat into the basket. She settled into the soft layers without protest, her breathing steady but shallow. Elliot positioned the basket near the rocking chair, then went to fetch the small space heater from the garage. The metal was cold against his hands as he carried it back, and he could feel the chill that had crept into the sunroom. The heater hummed to life, its warm air gradually pushing back the evening's coolness. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending shadows dancing across the walls. Elliot settled into the rocking chair, its familiar creaks mixing with the storm's symphony. "Claire would have loved you," he said softly, surprising himself by speaking aloud. His voice sounded strange in the empty room. He'd grown used to silence in the years since her passing. She always had a soft spot for strays. The goat's ears twitched slightly at the sound of his voice, though her eyes remained closed. Elliot found himself continuing, words spilling out like water from a long-sealed spring. She would have known exactly what to do. Probably would have had you eating from her hand by now. He smiled faintly at the thought. She was good at that, knowing how to make things feel safe. His voice cracked on her name, and he had to stop for a moment. The rocking chair's gentle motion helped steady him, as it had on so many sleepless nights after she'd gone. The rain continued its steady percussion on the windows, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the sky. Looking out through the glass, Elliot noticed the clouds beginning to thin. Patches of night sky appeared between their dark masses, and suddenly, there it was, the full moon, bright and clear, cutting through the storm like a beacon. The sight caught his breath. Claire had loved nights like this, when the moon seemed close enough to touch. She'd had a thing about names, too. Everything in her garden had one. Not just the plants, but the cardinals that visited the feeders, even the stray cat that sometimes slept on their porch. As moonlight spilled across the sunroom floor, reaching toward the basket where the little goat lay, Elliot felt something settle in his chest. "Luna," he whispered, testing the word. "That's what she would have named you." The goat shifted slightly in her nest, as if in response to her new name. Elliot stayed in the rocking chair for hours, watching over her, listening to the storm gradually fade into the quiet of late evening. Around midnight, he stood stiffly, his joints protesting the long vigil. Just one more check, he told himself, though he'd been making one more check every 15 minutes for the past hour. Luna lay exactly where he'd placed her, the pink towel rising and falling with each breath. As he leaned in to adjust the fabric around her, her head lifted slightly. Their eyes met, and something in her gaze, weak but unmistakably present, made his heart skip. It wasn't just a random glance. She was looking at him, acknowledging his presence. "You're safe now," he whispered, and meant it. The morning sun filtered through the rain-streaked windows of Elliot's kitchen, casting watery shadows across the worn linoleum floor. He stood at the counter, mechanically going through his daily ritual of making coffee. The familiar aroma of dark roast filled the air as he poured the steaming liquid into his favorite blue mug, the one with a chip on the rim that he couldn't bring himself to throw away. A soft bleat from the sunroom made him pause mid-sip. The sound was stronger than last night, but still held a note of desperation that tugged at his heart. Setting down his coffee, Elliot walked to check on his unexpected guest. Luna lay in her makeshift bed, her tiny head lifted toward him as he entered. The morning light revealed more details he hadn't noticed in last night's darkness. Her coat was a mottled brown and white, and her ears flopped forward in a way that made her look both pitiful and endearing. But what struck him most was how alert her eyes were, bright with hunger. "You need food," he muttered, running a hand through his gray-streaked hair. "And I've got nothing for you here." Elliot grabbed his truck keys from the hook by the door, the metal warm from the sun hitting it through the window. He patted Luna's head gently before heading out. "Hold on, little one. I'll be back soon." The drive into Fairpine was familiar but felt different somehow. Usually these morning trips into town were just errands to be endured, necessary interruptions to his carefully maintained solitude. Today, though, there was purpose in his movements, an urgency he hadn't felt in years. The bell above the door of Henderson's Feed and Hardware jingled as Elliot stepped inside. The store smelled of leather, sawdust, and farm animals, a scent that had barely changed in the 30 years he'd been shopping there. He stood awkwardly in the entrance, realizing he had no idea where to look for baby goat supplies. The aisle stretched before him like a maze, filled with tools, garden supplies, and animal feed. He wandered past shelves of horse brushes and chicken feed, feeling increasingly out of place. Finally, in the back corner, he found a section dedicated to livestock care. A young clerk with a name tag reading Tommy watched him with barely concealed curiosity as Elliot studied the labels on different milk replacer containers. His fingers traced over the instructions, trying to determine which would be best for such a young goat. "Can I help you find something?" Tommy asked, making Elliot jump slightly. Elliot cleared his throat. "Fostering an orphaned animal. Need some supplies." Tommy nodded, but didn't press further, though his raised eyebrow spoke volumes. Elliot grabbed a container of goat milk replacer, some bottles, and fresh bedding materials. He paid quickly, mumbling a thanks as he hurried out with his purchases. Back home, Elliot's kitchen took on the appearance of a makeshift veterinary clinic. He boiled water to sterilize the bottle, carefully measured the milk powder, and tested the temperature on his wrist, just as he remembered Claire doing with their niece's bottle years ago. Luna's first attempts at the bottle were hesitant. She turned her head away several times, making Elliot's heart sink. But he persisted, gently guiding the nipple to her mouth until something clicked. Her sudden, eager suckling surprised him, and a smile spread across his face before he even realized it was there. "There you go," he whispered, supporting her head as she drank. "That's better, isn't it?" After feeding, Luna dozed peacefully in her basket, her belly slightly rounded from the meal. Elliot busied himself cleaning up the kitchen, wiping down counters that probably didn't need it, reorganizing items in the cupboard that were already organized. As he worked, his eyes kept drifting to the hallway, specifically to the closed door at the end. Claire's piano room. He hadn't stepped foot in there since before. The thought of it usually sent him retreating to the safety of his routine, but today something was different. Maybe it was the way the morning light hit the doorknob, or perhaps it was the lingering warmth in his chest from feeding Luna. But Elliot found himself walking down the hallway. His hand trembled slightly as he turned the knob. The room was exactly as Claire had left it. Sheet music still sat open on the piano stand, her reading glasses perched on top. Dust motes danced in the sunbeam that cut through the window, making the scene look almost ethereal. The grand piano dominated the space, its black surface dulled by a layer of dust. Elliot approached slowly, as if the floor might crumble beneath his feet. His fingers traced the edge of the piano, leaving clean trails in the dust. With deliberate care, he wiped off the keys with his sleeve, revealing their familiar ivory and ebony pattern. One finger pressed down on middle C. The note rang out clear and true, filling the silent house with its vibration. Elliot held his breath as the sound faded, half expecting the weight of grief to crush him. Instead, he felt something else, a gentle ache, Yes, but also a strange sort of peace. That evening, Elliot sat in the rocking chair beside Luna's basket, a well-worn copy of Scientific American in his hands. The lamp cast a warm glow over them both as he read aloud about recent discoveries in deep space astronomy. His voice, unused to so much talking, grew stronger as he continued. Scientists have identified a new galaxy cluster, he read, then felt a gentle nudge against his leg. Looking down, he found Luna stretching her neck to bump her nose against him. The gesture was so unexpected, so deliberately affectionate, that a laugh escaped him, short and rusty from disuse, but genuine. "You like astronomy, huh?" he murmured, warmth filling his voice as he gazed down at the tiny goat. Luna just blinked up at him, her eyes reflecting the lamplight like stars. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows, casting warm squares of light across the worn linoleum floor. Elliot stirred a pot of oatmeal on the stove, the gentle bubbling of familiar comfort in the quiet house. Luna's soft bleats from the sunroom had become part of his morning routine, a reminder that he wasn't completely alone anymore. The crunch of tires on gravel cut through the peaceful morning. Elliot's hand stilled on the wooden spoon as he listened to a car door slam, followed by the sharp rhythm of dress shoes on the walkway. A knock echoed through the house, precise and demanding. When Elliot opened the front door, his younger brother Calvin stood there, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Elliot's monthly pension. A sleek leather suitcase sat by his polished shoes, and that familiar smirk played across his clean-shaven face. "Surprise, big brother," Calvin said, his voice carrying the crisp accent of someone who'd spent too many years in downtown Chicago. "Miss me?" Before Elliot could respond, Calvin brushed past him into the house, wheeling his suitcase across the threshold. The smell of expensive cologne filled the entryway, out of place among the old wood and worn furniture. "I figured it was time we settled things with Mom and Dad's place," Calvin announced, setting his suitcase down and scanning the living room with critical eyes. "And while we're at it, we should discuss what you're planning to do with all this." He gestured vaguely at the house around them. Elliot's stomach tightened. "I wasn't aware there was anything to discuss." "There's always something to discuss when it comes to property, Elliot." Calvin loosened his tie and started wandering through the house like he owned it. "The market's hot right now. It would be foolish not to at least consider our options." Elliot followed his brother's inspection tour, watching as Calvin ran his finger along a dusty windowsill and frowned at the aging wallpaper in the hallway. The house felt smaller somehow, as if Calvin's presence took up more space than it should. When they reached the sunroom, Luna lifted her head from her basket, her ears perked with curiosity at the new voice. Calvin stopped mid-stride, his eyebrows shooting up toward his hairline. "Is that a goat?" The words dripped with disbelief and something close to disdain. Calvin turned to face Elliot, shaking his head. "You've officially lost it, big brother." Elliot's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "Her name is Luna. I found her abandoned." "Of course you did." Calvin rolled his eyes. "Always picking up strays, aren't you? Just like Claire used to." He caught himself and cleared his throat. "Well, anyway, where's the guest room? I'll be here for a few days at least." Elliot led Calvin upstairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. The guest room was small but neat, with a twin bed and a dresser that had belonged to their parents. Calvin set his suitcase on the bed and immediately started unpacking, his movements precise and efficient. "We'll talk business over dinner," Calvin said, not looking up from his task. "I've got some numbers to run through with you." Elliot nodded silently and retreated downstairs. The oatmeal had cooled on the stove, forming a thick skin on top. He dumped it in the trash and started preparing Luna's afternoon bottle instead. finding comfort in the familiar routine. The rest of the day passed in a blur of awkward encounters and tense silences. Calvin set up a makeshift office at the kitchen table, spreading out papers and talking constantly on his phone about property values and market trends. His voice seemed to fill every corner of the house, leaving no room for the peace Elliot had grown accustomed to. After a simple dinner of reheated lasagna that Calvin barely touched, Elliot escaped to the sunroom with Luna. The evening light painted the walls in soft oranges and pinks, but the usual tranquility was broken by Calvin's voice carrying from the living room. "No, listen, the property values in this area are climbing," Calvin said into his phone, pacing back and forth. "We're talking serious potential here. The old house alone could fetch." "Yes, exactly. And then there's my brother's place. Sure, it needs work, but with the right buyer." He paused, lowering his voice slightly. "No, he's not thinking clearly. Hasn't been since his wife passed. Living out here alone. Now he's got some pet goat. Yeah, I know. Liability waiting to happen." Luna pressed closer to Elliot, her small body tense at the unfamiliar voice. Elliot ran his hand along her back, feeling the gentle rise and fall of her breathing. "Don't worry," he whispered, his words barely audible over Calvin's continued conversation. "He's not staying forever." The morning sun struggled through rain-streaked windows as Elliot stood at the stove, mechanically stirring scrambled eggs. Steam rose from his coffee mug, swirling in the quiet kitchen air. Luna's soft bleats drifted from her basket in the sunroom, a gentle reminder of life amid the heavy silence. The floorboards creaked overhead, followed by footsteps on the stairs. Calvin appeared in the doorway, already dressed in pressed slacks and a button-down shirt, looking more like he was headed to court than spending a morning in the country. He stretched dramatically and started opening cabinet doors without asking. "Where do you keep the decent coffee?" Calvin asked, his nose wrinkling at Elliot's simple tin of grocery store grounds. "This stuff is barely a step above dirt." Elliot didn't answer, just divided the eggs onto 2 plates and set them on the old oak table. The scratches in its surface told stories of family dinners, homework sessions, and Claire's late-night grading marathons. Every mark held a memory. Calvin grabbed a mug and helped himself to coffee anyway, then slid into his chair. Rain pattered against the windows as they ate in silence. The only sounds were forks scraping plates and Luna's occasional movements in her basket. "You know," Calvin said finally, pushing his half-eaten eggs around his plate, "this place is becoming a monument to decay." He gestured broadly with his fork. "The paint's peeling, the roof needs work, and don't get me started on that barn. You're living in a museum of better days, El." Elliot's jaw tightened. He stared down at his coffee, watching ripples form as his hand clenched around the mug. "It's time to cut ties with the past," Calvin continued, his voice taking on that smooth lawyer tone he used in negotiations. "We could list this property tomorrow and have offers by next week. The land alone." "No." Elliot's voice was quiet, but firm. "Be reasonable," Calvin pressed. "You're rattling around this big house alone, letting everything fall apart. What would Claire think?" The mug slammed down hard enough to splash coffee onto the table. "Don't." Elliot's eyes finally met his brother's, burning with an intensity that made Calvin lean back slightly. "Don't you dare talk about what Claire would think. You weren't here. El Guion, you weren't here." The words came faster now, charged with 2 years of buried pain. "Where were you when she died, Calvin? Where were you at the funeral?" The memory crashed over him like a wave. Sitting alone in the front pew of the Lutheran church, Claire's favorite hymn echoing off empty walls. He'd kept turning around, hoping to see his brother hurrying in late, making excuses about Chicago traffic or a delayed flight. But the back row where Calvin should have been stayed empty, collecting dust motes in the colored light from the stained glass windows. "I had a case," Calvin said stiffly. "I sent flowers." "Flowers." Elliot laughed, a hollow sound. "My wife, your sister-in-law of 25 years, dies after fighting cancer for 18 months, and you sent flowers." He pushed back from the table, the chair legs scraping harshly against the floor. "I needed my brother. I needed family. But you were too busy with your case." Calvin's face flushed. "That's not fair. I had obligations." "Obligations?" Elliot's voice cracked. "I spent 6 months sleeping in hospital chairs. I watched her fade away day by day. Where were your obligations then?" Before Calvin could respond, Elliot walked out of the kitchen. He needed air. The morning was damp and cool, but he barely noticed as he headed toward the barn. Luna's concerned bleat followed him out. He'd barely reached the barn door when he heard footsteps behind him. Calvin had followed, that determined look on his face that meant he wasn't done. Elliot's brother brushed past him into the barn, pulling out his phone and turning on its flashlight. "Look at this place," Calvin said, sweeping the beam across dusty farm equipment and stacked hay bales. "Half this stuff could be sold for good money. With some basic repairs, we could—" "We?" Elliot's voice was dangerously quiet. "You've had 2 years, El," Calvin said, making notes in his phone. "Time's up. This place needs decisions made, and clearly you're not in a state to—" Elliot turned and walked out, his boots heavy with mud and emotion. The old barn door creaked shut behind him, cutting off whatever else Calvin was saying. The rain had started again, but Elliot barely felt it. "You didn't come when she died," he muttered, hands clenched at his sides. "Don't pretend to care now." Thunder rumbled in the distance as Elliot moved methodically through the house, pulling windows shut against the approaching storm. Each flash of lightning illuminated the darkening rooms in brief, harsh bursts. The air felt heavy with electricity, making the hair on his arms stand up. In the sunroom, Luna shifted restlessly in her basket, her tiny hooves rustling against the soft towels. Her dark eyes followed Elliot as he adjusted the small space heater, positioning it to create a pocket of warmth without being too close to her bedding. The storm was clearly making her nervous. She'd never experienced one before. "It's okay, girl," Elliot murmured, kneeling beside her basket. He tucked an extra blanket around her, making sure it was snug but not confining. "Just some noise and light. Nothing to worry about." Luna pressed her head against his hand, seeking comfort. The gesture made his throat tight. It reminded him so much of how Claire used to squeeze his hand during thunderstorms. From the living room, Calvin's voice carried sharp and clear. "No, you don't understand. I'm literally trapped out here in the woods with my crazy brother and a goat. A goat!" He was pacing, his designer shoes clicking against the hardwood floors. "The property's barely worth what we could get for it, and he's acting like it's some kind of shrine." Elliot's jaw clenched, but he kept his focus on Luna. She bleated softly, the sound barely audible over another roll of thunder. Through the windows, he could see the wind picking up, bending the old oak trees that lined the driveway. "Look, I'll call you back tomorrow," Calvin continued, his voice getting closer. "Maybe by then I'll have talked some sense into him. The longer we wait, the more work this place needs." Yeah, bye." Elliot heard his brother's footsteps approaching the sunroom. He didn't look up when Calvin appeared in the doorway, just kept stroking Luna's head. "Seriously?" Calvin's voice dripped with disdain. "That thing's bleeding is driving me crazy. Can't you put it in the barn or something?" "She's too young," Elliot replied quietly, still not looking up. "And there's a storm coming." "Right, because heaven forbid anything happened to your replacement therapy animal." Calvin stepped into the sunroom, peering down at Luna with a mixture of confusion and irritation. "You know this isn't healthy, right? First the house, now this." Luna bleated again, louder this time, startled by a particularly close crack of thunder. Calvin flinched at the sound. "Whatever," he muttered, turning to leave. "I'm going to make some calls." He pushed the door, but it didn't click shut behind him. Whether he noticed or cared wasn't clear. Elliot stayed with Luna until she settled again, then headed to the kitchen to heat up some soup for dinner. The old copper-bottomed pot had been Claire's favorite. She'd found it at a garage sale their first summer in the house. The memory made him smile slightly as he stirred the warming liquid. Rain began to pelt the kitchen windows, creating a steady drumming sound throughout the house. The storm had arrived in earnest now, and occasional flashes of lightning cast strange shadows across the countertops. Calvin's voice rose and fell in the background, punctuated by thunder. After about an hour, Elliot ladled some soup into a bowl and grabbed a small plate of fruit he'd cut earlier for Luna. She liked to nibble on apple slices before bed, another little routine they'd developed over the past few days. It wasn't much, but these small moments of caregiving had begun to fill some of the endless empty spaces in his days. He carried the plate toward the sunroom, noting absently that the rain was coming down in sheets now. The wind howled around the corners of the house, making the windows rattle slightly in their frames. He'd have to check the roof tomorrow for any new leaks. Pushing open the sunroom door with his elbow, Elliot stepped inside. "Time for your bedtime snack, Lou." The words died in his throat. The basket was empty. The blankets were disturbed, trailing over the side like someone had climbed out, or like something small had wriggled free. Elliot's eyes darted to the door leading to the porch. It was open just enough for a tiny goat to squeeze through. The plate of fruit clattered to the floor. "Luna?" His voice cracked as he searched the corners of the room, knowing already she wouldn't be there. "Luna!" He burst into the kitchen. Empty. The front porch. Empty. Each room he checked increased the panic rising in his chest. "Calvin!" he shouted, his voice barely carrying over the storm. "Did you see Luna?" His brother appeared in the hallway, phone still in hand. "What?" "No, I'm on a call." The sunroom door was open. Elliot cut him off, already grabbing a flashlight from the drawer. "She's gone." "It's pouring out there," Calvin started, but Elliot was already yanking open the front door. The rain hit him like a wall of cold water, instantly soaking through his shirt. He didn't even think about grabbing a coat. "Luna!" he called into the darkness, sweeping the flashlight beam across the yard. The wind whipped his words away almost before they left his mouth. "Luna, where are you?" Lightning flashed, illuminating the empty driveway and the swaying trees beyond. Somewhere out there, a tiny, frightened goat was alone in the storm. Elliot plunged into the rain, his heart pounding with a fear he hadn't felt since the night Claire collapsed in their kitchen. He wouldn't lose Luna, too. He couldn't. Rain pelted Elliot's face as he swept the flashlight beam across the yard, his clothes already soaked through. The wind whipped around him, carrying Luna's name away each time he called it. His boots squelched in the mud as he circled the barn for the third time, heart pounding against his ribs. "Luna!" His voice cracked with desperation. Lightning split the sky, followed by a deafening crack of thunder that made him flinch. The brief flash illuminated the empty driveway, the dark windows of the church next door, and the deep ditches filling with murky water. Elliot's hands shook as he wiped rain from his eyes. He had already checked the front yard twice, but fear drove him forward. The beam of light bounced wildly as he jogged along the house's foundation, scanning for any sign of movement. Water streamed from his hair into his eyes, and his sodden jacket felt like it weighed 50 pounds. Another flash of lightning revealed the old wooden fence posts marking the property line. Beyond them lay dense woods. If Luna had wandered that far, he might never find her. The thought sent a spike of panic through his chest. She was too weak to survive a night like this alone. "Please," he whispered, though he wasn't sure who he was talking to. "Please, let me find her." Thunder boomed overhead as Elliot rounded the corner to the west side of the house. His flashlight beam caught the twisted branches of Claire's rosebush, now overgrown and wild. She'd spent countless spring mornings tending those roses, pruning them with careful hands, talking softly to the plants as she worked. The thorny branches swayed in the wind, casting strange shadows on the ground. Elliot almost walked past it, but something made him pause, made him swing the light back. There, beneath the lowest branches, barely visible through the leaves and mud, was a tiny dark shape. His knees hit the wet ground hard as he dropped beside the bush. "Luna?" The shape moved slightly, and a weak bleat answered him. Elliot's hands trembled as he reached through the thorny branches, ignoring the sharp pricks against his skin. His fingers found wet fur, and he carefully pulled Luna free from her hiding place. She was shivering violently, her small body cold and completely soaked. Leaves and twigs clung to her fur, and her eyes were wide with fear. Elliot quickly shrugged out of his jacket, wrapping it around her like a blanket, despite it being nearly as wet as she was. "I've got you," he whispered, cradling her against his chest. "I've got you." He repeated the words like a prayer as he rocked back and forth, relief making him lightheaded. Luna pressed closer to him, seeking warmth. Lightning flashed again as Elliot struggled to his feet, holding Luna securely. He hurried back to the house, boots leaving muddy tracks across the kitchen floor as he made his way to the sunroom. With gentle hands, he unwrapped his soaked jacket and grabbed fresh towels from the nearby stack, carefully drying Luna's trembling form. "You're safe now," he murmured, working methodically to warm her. "You're safe." His own clothes dripped steadily onto the floor, creating small puddles, but he barely noticed. All his attention was focused on Luna, on making sure she was okay. Once she was reasonably dry, Elliot placed her in the basket where the space heater had kept the bedding warm and cozy. Luna curled up immediately, pressing close to the heated air. Her shivering gradually began to slow. Elliot sat beside the basket, his chest tight with lingering fear and growing anger. Water ran from his hair down his neck, and his clothes clung uncomfortably to his skin. But he couldn't bring himself to leave Luna's side just yet. He needed to see her settle, needed to know she was truly all right. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made him tense. Calvin appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Before he could speak, Elliot turned to face him, fury burning in his chest. "You did this!" The words came out low and harsh. Calvin opened his mouth, but Elliot cut him off before he could form a response. "You don't get to destroy what little I have left." His voice shook with emotion he'd been holding back for years: grief, anger, betrayal. Without waiting for Calvin's response, Elliot walked back into the sunroom and firmly shut the door behind him. Luna bleated softly from her basket, as if sensing his distress. Outside, thunder continued to rumble, but the storm's fury seemed to be passing. The morning sun filtered through the sunroom windows, casting warm patches of light across the floor. Elliot knelt beside Luna's basket, carefully testing the temperature of the milk replacer on his wrist. The storm had left everything outside gleaming and fresh, but inside, the house felt heavy with unspoken words. Luna's ears perked up as Elliot approached with the bottle. She was still weak from her ordeal, but her eyes were bright and alert. "There's my girl," he murmured, settling down beside her. She latched onto the bottle eagerly, and Elliot found himself relaxing slightly as he watched her feed. "We had quite a night, didn't we?" he said softly, adjusting the blanket around her. The morning birds provided a gentle chorus outside, so different from last night's howling wind and thunder. Luna's tail twitched as she drank, and Elliot noticed with relief that her shivering had completely stopped. When the bottle was empty, Elliot carefully wiped Luna's face with a soft cloth. He replaced her damp bedding with fresh towels, making sure everything was warm and clean. "You gave me quite a scare," he told her, running his hand gently along her back. Luna responded with a tiny bleat that made his throat tight. In the kitchen, Calvin sat at the table, a cold cup of coffee forgotten in front of him. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usually precise appearance was rumpled. He stared at his hands, fingers tracing patterns on the wooden tabletop. The morning ticked by in tense silence. Elliot moved between the sunroom and kitchen, preparing more bottles, checking Luna's temperature, adjusting her blankets. Each time he passed, Calvin seemed to sink further into himself. Finally, around mid-morning, Calvin's voice broke the quiet. "I didn't mean to let her out." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with regret. Elliot continued measuring milk powder into a clean bottle, his movements precise and controlled. He didn't respond, but his shoulders were rigid with tension. "I was frustrated," Calvin continued, his voice rough, "but I never meant—" He trailed off, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "I'm sorry, El." The nickname landed like a stone in still water. Elliot hadn't heard Calvin call him that since before Claire's funeral, before everything changed. Sunlight crept across the kitchen floor as the morning wore on. Calvin remained at the table, watching as Elliot cared for Luna. Something in his brother's gentle attention to the small creature seemed to crack open Calvin's carefully maintained facade. "I couldn't come to the funeral," he said suddenly, the words tumbling out like they'd been waiting years to escape. "I couldn't. I didn't know how to face your grief, how to mourn her with you." Elliot's hand stilled on the bottle he was washing. For a long moment, only the sound of running water filled the kitchen. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse with emotion. "You didn't have to mourn with me," he said. "You just had to show up." The truth of it seemed to hit Calvin physically. He slumped in his chair, looking older than Elliot had ever seen him. "I know," he whispered. "I know that now." As afternoon light slanted through the windows, the brothers began to talk, really talk, for the first time in years. Their words were careful at first, like people testing thin ice, but gradually the conversation deepened. "She's not just a pet," Elliot explained, glancing toward the sunroom where Luna rested. "When I found her, I was—" He paused, searching for words. "I was so locked up inside myself, hadn't touched Claire's piano, couldn't look at her photos, but Luna needed me. She didn't care that I was broken. She just needed someone to care for her." Calvin listened, really listened, perhaps for the first time since arriving. His usual sharp edges seemed softened. "The night I found her," Elliot continued, "I used Claire's pink towel to dry her off. Just reached for it without thinking. First time I touched anything of hers without it hurting." He smiled faintly. "Luna gave me permission to feel again, I guess. To care about something." The afternoon wore on as they talked. About Claire, about their parents, about the years of distance that had grown between them. Calvin spoke about his own grief, how he'd buried it under work and rationality until he couldn't recognize himself anymore. Elliot shared stories about Luna's first days with him, how she'd brought light back into the house, how her presence had somehow made Claire feel closer instead of further away. "She's like a bridge," he explained, "between who I was and who I might be now." As evening approached, Calvin stood and walked to the sunroom doorway. He watched Luna sleeping peacefully in her basket, the space heater humming softly nearby. "I get it now," he said quietly. "Why you need her." Later that night, around 9:30, Elliot brought out an old bottle of scotch and 2 glasses. He poured them each a measure and handed one to Calvin. They sat in the living room, the silence between them different now, comfortable instead of charged. Calvin swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "I'll fix the back fence tomorrow," he said softly. Elliot nodded, looking at his brother over the rim of his glass. "Good." The morning sun streamed through the sunroom windows, painting warm squares of light across the wooden floor. Luna, her energy visibly restored after yesterday's ordeal, trotted around with newfound confidence. Her tiny hooves made soft clicking sounds against the floorboards as she explored, pausing occasionally to nibble playfully at Elliot's sock. "Hey now," Elliot chuckled, reaching down to scoop her up. She settled contentedly in his lap, her warm weight familiar and comforting. He sipped his coffee, watching as she attempted to nose the mug curiously. "That's not for you, little one." The house felt different this morning. The heavy silence that had pressed down on them for days had lifted, replaced by something lighter, more peaceful. Even the sunlight seemed cleaner somehow, as if the storm had washed away more than just dust from the windows. Through the glass, Elliot could see Calvin in the backyard, already working on the fence. His brother had started early, gathering tools from the barn without being asked. Now he moved methodically along the wooden panels, checking each board, replacing the rotted ones with fresh lumber they'd picked up from town. Luna bleated softly, drawing Elliot's attention back inside. She had managed to climb onto his shoulder, her small face pressed against his neck. All right," he said, carefully lifting her down. "Let me finish this coffee, and we'll go see what Uncle Calvin is up to." The word uncle slipped out without thought, and Elliot paused, surprised by how natural it felt. He shook his head, smiling slightly, and finished his coffee. Outside, the morning air was crisp and clean. Calvin looked up briefly as Elliot approached, then returned to his work. Without speaking, Elliot noticed the screwdriver Calvin needed and handed it over. His brother took it with a nod, and they fell into an easy rhythm. They worked side by side, the silence between them comfortable now. The steady rhythm of hammering and the soft squeak of screws being driven home filled the air. Every so often, one would hold a board, while the other secured it, their movements coordinated without need for discussion. As the sun climbed higher, Luna ventured out onto the grass under their watchful eyes. Her legs were still a bit wobbly, but she managed to hop and skip around the yard, occasionally stopping to investigate a dandelion or chase a butterfly. Her antics drew their attention, and both men found themselves pausing their work to watch her clumsy exploration. "Would you look at that?" Calvin said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "She walks like you used to after prom night." The comment caught Elliot off guard, and he let out a genuine laugh, a sound that seemed to surprise them both. "If I remember correctly," he countered, "you weren't exactly graceful yourself that night." Calvin grinned, setting down his hammer. "Mom was so mad when we came home and knocked over her favorite vase." Dad couldn't stop laughing, though, Elliot remembered, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Remember how his whole face would turn red when he really got going. They moved inside for lunch, leaving Luna to nap in her basket. Calvin pulled out bread and cold cuts while Elliot grabbed plates. The kitchen, which had felt like a battlefield just yesterday, now held a warm familiarity. "You know," Calvin said, assembling his sandwich, "we had a goat when we were kids, remember? That old Billy that used to chase me around the yard?" Elliot raised an eyebrow. "That wasn't a goat, Cal. It was Mrs. Peterson's sheep that got loose. You just thought it was a goat because of the beard." "No way," Calvin protested, but there was laughter in his voice. "It was definitely a goat. It ate Mom's prize roses." "That was you. You knocked them over playing baseball and blamed it on a non-existent goat." The brothers looked at each other for a moment before both burst out laughing. The sound echoed through the kitchen, bouncing off the walls that had held so much silence for so long. "Mom's pies, though," Calvin said softly, once their laughter had subsided. "Nobody could make a cherry pie like she could." "Remember how she'd always save the extra filling for us?" Elliot smiled, lost in the memory. "We'd eat it straight from the bowl while it was still warm." The afternoon light began to soften, casting long shadows across the yard. They finished the fence work as the sun began to set, their bodies tired but satisfied with the day's accomplishments. Luna had taken several more supervised excursions outside, growing bolder each time. As evening settled in, they found themselves on the porch, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. Luna dozed contentedly in Elliot's lap, her small body rising and falling with each breath. The porch light buzzed softly above them, attracting moths that danced in lazy circles around the bulb. Calvin looked over at the sleeping goat, a small smile playing at his lips. "She's got a funny little face," he observed. Elliot nodded, gently stroking Luna's ear. "Yeah," he replied softly. "She does." The porch light continued its gentle buzzing, a peaceful soundtrack to the quiet that had finally found its way back between the brothers. Monday morning arrived with a stillness that felt different from the peaceful quiet of recent days. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows across the sunroom floor, when Elliot woke to Luna's bleat. Something about the sound made his heart skip. It was too soft, too weak. He threw off his covers and hurried to the sunroom, his bare feet cold against the wooden floors. Luna lay on her side in her basket, her small body barely moving. Her eyes, usually bright and alert in the mornings, looked glazed and distant. "Luna!" Elliot's voice cracked as he knelt beside her. His hands shook as he touched her side, feeling her shallow breathing. "No, no, no." "Calvin!" The shout tore from his throat before he could think. He heard quick footsteps in the hallway as his brother appeared in the doorway, still in his sleep clothes. "What's wrong?" Calvin asked, but his expression changed the moment he saw Luna's condition. "I'll get the truck started." Elliot grabbed the softest towel from Luna's bedding and wrapped her gently, cradling her like she was made of glass. Her head lolled against his arm, and the panic in his chest tightened. She felt lighter somehow, as if she was already slipping away. Calvin had the truck running, driver's door open, when Elliot emerged from the house. Without a word, Calvin helped steady his brother as he climbed into the passenger seat. Luna bundled carefully in his lap. The morning air was crisp, their breath visible in small clouds as Calvin backed out of the driveway. The drive to the veterinary clinic stretched endless before them. An hour of winding country roads, each bump making Elliot wince as he tried to keep Luna stable. Neither brother spoke. The radio remained off. The only sounds were the rumble of tires on asphalt and Luna's labored breathing. Calvin drove faster than usual, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Every few minutes he glanced over at Elliot and Luna, his jaw tight with worry. The morning sun climbed higher, but neither man noticed the beauty of the dawn-painted sky. When they finally reached the clinic, Calvin jumped out first, rushing to help Elliot with Luna. The automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh, releasing a wave of antiseptic-scented air. The receptionist took one look at their faces and Luna's limp form and immediately called for Dr. Renner. A veterinary technician whisked Luna away, leaving Elliot standing empty-handed in the sterile waiting room. His arms felt wrong without her weight. Calvin guided him to a chair, then sat beside him, their shoulders almost touching. Minutes crawled by like hours. Elliot's hands clenched and unclenched in his lap, his wedding ring catching the fluorescent light. Calvin attempted small talk once or twice, but his words fell flat in the heavy air. Other pet owners came and went, their own dramas playing out in quiet murmurs and worried glances. After what felt like an eternity, Dr. Renner appeared in the doorway. His face carried the weight of news no one wanted to deliver. Elliot stood immediately, Calvin rising beside him like a shadow. "Mr. Hayes," Dr. Renner began, his voice gentle but direct, "please, sit down." He pulled up a chair across from them, leaning forward with his hands clasped. "I've completed a thorough examination of Luna, including some imaging tests." Elliot's throat felt too tight to speak. Calvin's hand found his shoulder, squeezing slightly. "Luna has a congenital heart defect," Dr. Renner continued. "It's genetic, something she was born with. The walls of her heart are malformed, and there's significant valve damage." He paused, allowing the information to sink in. "I'm very sorry, but there's no surgical solution for a case this severe, especially in such a young animal." The words hit Elliot like physical blows. Each sentence stripped away another layer of hope until nothing remained but raw truth. "How ... Elliot's voice came out, barely above a whisper. "How long?" Dr. Renner's eyes held deep compassion as he answered, "She might have a few days, maybe a week, if we keep her comfortable. We can provide medication to ease any discomfort, but..." He shook his head slightly. "The kindest thing now is to focus on her quality of life for whatever time remains." Calvin's grip on Elliot's shoulder tightened. The waiting room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in with suffocating weight. Elliot barely heard the rest of Dr. Renner's instructions about medication and care. His mind kept circling back to Luna's first night, how she'd looked at him with such trust when he'd whispered, "You're safe now." They left the clinic with a small bag of medicine and Luna wrapped in fresh blankets. The morning had fully arrived now, but gray clouds had rolled in, matching the heavy atmosphere. As they sat in the truck, neither moving to start the engine, the first drops of rain began to fall, creating tiny dark spots on the windshield. Calvin turned slightly in his seat, his expression unusually gentle. "Maybe this is life's way of telling you it's time to let go. Of all of it." Elliot remained silent, his hand resting protectively over the towel-covered bundle in his lap. Luna stirred slightly beneath his touch, and he felt the faint beat of her heart. Too fast, too weak, but still fighting. The afternoon light filtered weakly through the gauzy curtains Elliot had drawn across the sunroom windows. The soft fabric diffused the brightness into a gentle glow that settled like dust over Luna's makeshift bed. Elliot's hands trembled slightly as he arranged the blankets, creating a nest of warmth and comfort for her tiny body. "There we go," he whispered, his voice catching in his throat. Luna's eyes, still bright despite her condition, followed his movements. She let out a weak bleat that seemed to echo in the hushed room. The house felt different now, heavier somehow, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The tick of the old grandfather clock in the hallway marked time with merciless precision, each second falling like a stone into still water. Calvin stood in the doorway, watching his brother fuss with the blankets for the 5th time in as many minutes. He opened his mouth to speak, then thought better of it. Instead, he retreated quietly to the kitchen, where he began washing the breakfast dishes they'd left forgotten in their rush to the vet. As the days crept by, Elliot moved through the house like a shadow. Food lost its taste. Sleep became elusive. He measured time not in hours, but in Luna's feedings, small, precious moments when she would still take a little milk from the bottle, her strength visibly fading with each passing day. The morning light would find him already awake, sitting beside Luna's basket. The evening would settle around him in the same position, his untouched dinner growing cold on the kitchen counter. Words became unnecessary luxuries, too heavy to carry. Calvin watched this quiet descent with growing concern. He knew better than to push, remembering too well how his attempts to rush Elliot's grief after Claire's death had only driven them further apart. Instead, he found ways to be useful without being intrusive. He fixed the squeaking hinge on the screen door that had bothered him since arrival. He organized the cluttered workbench in the barn, carefully arranging tools that hadn't been touched in months. One afternoon, while Luna dozed fitfully, Elliot found himself drawn to the old oak desk in the study. His fingers traced the worn edges until they found the bottom drawer. Inside lay a leather-bound journal, its spine still stiff with disuse. Claire's parting gift when he'd retired from teaching. "For all those thoughts that keep you up at night," she'd written on the first page. Elliot's hand shook as he opened it. The blank pages seemed to stare back at him, patient and waiting. He picked up a pen, its weight unfamiliar after so long. The words came slowly at first, then faster. "I don't know how to say goodbye twice." The pen scratched across the paper, giving voice to things he couldn't say aloud. About Claire, about Luna, about the way grief seemed to echo grief, each loss awakening the memory of the last. The piano in the corner gathered dust once more. The brief resurrection of music that Luna had inspired fell silent again, as if the very act of playing might disturb her rest. The keys sat untouched, like teeth clenched against speaking painful truths. Calvin found ways to be present without hovering. He brought glasses of water that Elliot didn't drink and sandwiches that went mostly untouched. He swept the porch, cleared away dead leaves from Claire's rose bush, and kept his phone calls brief and quiet. Luna's decline was gentle but steady, like watching a flower slowly close its petals. Her bleats grew softer, her movements more measured. She still responded to Elliot's touch, turning her head slightly when he stroked her ears, but her energy ebbed like a retreating tide. That night, Elliot lay on the floor beside Luna's basket, the hardwood cool against his cheek, his arm draped protectively over her small form, feeling the flutter of her heartbeat against his palm, quick and light like a bird's wings. "Did I ever tell you about the Pleiades?" he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. "They're a cluster of stars, bright little points of blue light. The ancient Greeks called them the Seven Sisters." His fingers gently stroked Luna's side as he spoke. "Claire loved them. She used to say they looked like diamonds scattered on black velvet." Luna's ears twitched slightly at the sound of his voice. Elliot continued, weaving together stories of constellations and memories of Claire, of scientific wonders and personal truths. His words floated in the darkness like stardust, a gentle shower of remembrance and love. "You know what Claire would say about you," he murmured. "She'd say you were proof that the universe knows exactly what it's doing, that sometimes the smallest things carry the biggest purpose." His voice cracked slightly. "She always saw the meaning in everything." The night pressed in around them, soft and close. Luna's heartbeat continued its delicate rhythm under his hand, each pulse a precious signal. Elliot kept talking, his whispered words creating a cocoon of comfort around them both. About neutron stars and nebulae, about Claire's laugh and her favorite flowers, about the way light travels through space for years just to reach Earth, as if even the stars understood the importance of showing up, no matter how long the journey. The evening breeze whispered through the old farmhouse, rustling curtains and carrying the sweet scent of spring through open windows. Elliot's footsteps were heavy as he walked from the sunroom, his shoulders bent with the weight of watching Luna grow weaker by the hour. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet as he entered the kitchen, where he found Calvin sitting quietly at the worn oak table. A small cardboard box sat before his brother, its edges soft and worn with age. Calvin's fingers rested lightly on its lid, and something in his expression made Elliot pause in the doorway. "Found this while cleaning out Mom and Dad's place," Calvin said softly, his usual sharp edge absent from his voice. "Actually, I found it months ago. Been carrying it around in my suitcase, trying to figure out when to give it to you." Elliot pulled out a chair and sat down slowly, his eyes fixed on the mysterious box. Calvin carefully lifted the lid and reached inside, pulling out a stack of yellowed envelopes tied together with a faded blue ribbon. "They're all addressed to Claire," Calvin said, turning one over to show Elliot the careful handwriting on the front. "From you." Elliot's breath caught in his throat. He recognized his own penmanship immediately. Younger, more careful than it was now, but unmistakably his. With trembling fingers, he reached for the stack. "I never sent these," he whispered, untying the ribbon. The paper felt delicate beneath his touch, like autumn leaves ready to crumble. "I wrote them our first year of college, when we were dating long distance. I was too embarrassed to mail them." Calvin picked up one of the envelopes that had fallen loose. "Mind if I?" he asked, waiting for Elliot's slight nod before carefully extracting the letter inside. The kitchen grew still as Calvin began to read, his voice soft but clear. "Dear Claire, I saw a shooting star tonight and immediately thought of you. Remember that night we spent on the football field, counting meteors and making wishes? You said every star was a possibility waiting to happen. I didn't tell you then, but I used all my wishes on the same thing. A little house somewhere quiet, with a garden for you to tend, and a piano for me to play. A place where we could grow old together, watching the stars and counting our blessings." Elliot's hands gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. The words hit him like physical blows, each one a reminder of the hopeful young man he'd been, so full of dreams and certainty about the future. Calvin continued reading. "Sometimes when I'm in physics class, I think about how the universe had to align perfectly for us to meet. All those random moments that led us to the same place at the same time. It makes me believe in magic, or at least in the kind of science that feels like magic. You'd laugh at me for being so sentimental, but I don't care. You make me want to write poetry about quantum mechanics." A choked sound escaped Elliot's throat, something between a laugh and a sob. Calvin paused, looking up at his brother with gentle concern. "I don't—" Elliot's voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I don't even recognize that person anymore. That hopeful kid who could write about stars and quantum mechanics and believe in perfect futures." He pressed his palms against his eyes, trying to hold back tears. "I lost him somewhere along the way." Calvin set the letter down carefully and reached across the table, placing a steady hand on Elliot's shoulder. "She did," he said quietly. "She never stopped seeing that person in you, El. Even at the end." The simple truth of those words broke something loose in Elliot's chest. Tears slipped past his defenses, falling onto the scattered envelopes. Calvin's hand remained on his shoulder, an anchor in the storm of grief. "You know what else she saw?" Calvin continued, his voice rough with emotion. "She saw how that starry-eyed kid grew into someone even stronger. Someone who could love deeply enough to risk having his heart broken. Someone who could find room in that broken heart to care for a sick little goat." From the sunroom came Luna's soft bleat, as if she knew they were talking about her. Elliot wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and looked toward the sound. "I should check on her," he said, gathering the letters carefully. Calvin nodded, squeezing his shoulder once before letting go. The moon was just beginning to rise as Elliot settled into his usual spot beside Luna's basket. Her small form was curled beneath the blankets, her breathing shallow but steady. He held up one of the envelopes, turning it so the moonlight caught the careful script of Claire's name. "Want to hear a story, little one?" he asked softly. Luna's ears twitched at the sound of his voice. He carefully opened the envelope, unfolding the paper inside. His younger self's words stared back at him, full of hope and love and possibility. "Dear Claire," he began reading, his voice gentle in the growing darkness. Luna's ears perked up slightly, and for a moment, Elliot could almost feel Claire there too, listening with that same patient smile she'd always had for his sentimental side. The first hints of dawn crept through the sunroom's gauzy curtains, painting the walls in soft watercolor shades of pink and gold. Elliot's eyes fluttered open at a sound so faint it might have been a dream. Luna's gentle bleat, barely more than a whisper. His back ached from sleeping on the hardwood floor beside her basket, but he hardly noticed the discomfort as he pushed himself up onto his elbows. "Luna?" he whispered, his voice rough with sleep. The tiny goat lay curled in her nest of blankets, her eyes open but distant, like she was looking at something far beyond the sunroom walls. When she noticed Elliot stirring, she lifted her head slightly, an effort that seemed to take all her strength, and nudged his outstretched hand with her nose. Elliot's heart clenched at how weak the gesture was. With careful movements, he lifted her from the basket and cradled her in his lap, supporting her head in the crook of his arm. Luna settled against his chest, her small body trembling slightly. "There's my girl," he murmured, running his fingers gently through her soft fur. The morning light caught in her eyes, making them shine like amber. She was still here, still fighting, and Elliot was determined to make every moment count. He spent the morning talking to her, his voice low and steady. He told her about the constellations visible from the farmhouse porch, about how the stars had always made him feel small, but never alone. As he warmed some milk in a bottle, he hummed Claire's favorite lullaby, the one she used to sing while making Sunday breakfast, her voice carrying through the house like sunshine. "Claire would have loved you," he said, carefully helping Luna take tiny sips from the bottle. "She always said the best things in life come unexpectedly." He smiled, remembering. "Like the time we were painting the kitchen and ended up dancing instead. The radio was playing that old Sinatra song. You know the one." He hummed a few bars, rocking Luna gently in time with the melody. The morning stretched into afternoon, and Elliot kept talking. He told Luna about his first day teaching science, how terrified he'd been until a student asked about black holes, and suddenly he was lost in the wonder of it all. He spoke about the day he met Claire, about their first date stargazing in his beat-up pickup truck, about how she'd known all the constellations by heart. "I'd never held anything so precious before," he said softly, remembering the first time Claire had placed her hand in his. "Until you came along." Luna's ears twitched at his words, and she pressed closer to his chest. Around 2:00, the sunroom door creaked open. Calvin stood in the doorway, hesitating for a moment before stepping inside. He moved quietly, settling into the old wicker chair in the corner. He didn't speak, didn't try to offer empty comfort or practical solutions. He simply sat, bearing witness to his brother's gentle vigil. The afternoon light shifted, casting long shadows across the floor. Elliot continued his quiet monologue, sharing memories he hadn't spoken aloud in years. He told Luna about the garden Claire had planted, how she'd insisted on growing flowers that attracted butterflies, about the time they'd gotten lost on a road trip and discovered the best pie shop in 3 states. About the way Claire could always tell when he was worried, even when he tried to hide it. Calvin remained in his corner, listening. Occasionally, Elliot would catch him wiping his eyes, but neither brother acknowledged it. The room felt sacred somehow, like a church filled with whispered prayers and silent understanding. As evening approached, Elliot moved to the window, with Luna still cradled in his arms. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple. He began to rock slowly, the way Claire used to rock in this very spot, watching the stars emerge one by one. Luna's breathing grew slower, more peaceful. Her small body relaxed completely in his arms, trusting and unafraid. Then, as quietly as she had entered his life, she slipped away. No struggle, no pain, just a gentle release, like a sigh carried away on the evening breeze. Elliot held her close, pressing his cheek against her head. His voice was steady but thick with emotion as he whispered, "Thank you for finding me." The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Elliot stood at the counter, watching steam rise from his coffee cup in delicate spirals. His hair was still damp from the shower, and drops of water occasionally fell from the ends onto his collar. He hadn't slept much, but there was a different kind of energy coursing through him today. Not the frantic, desperate energy of grief, but something steadier, more purposeful. The coffee maker gurgled its final drops, and he poured a second cup, adding cream the way Calvin liked it. As he walked down the hallway, he passed the sunroom without breaking stride. The empty basket sat by the window, morning light catching the edges of the blankets still nestled inside. His chest tightened, but he kept walking. Outside, the spring air carried the fresh scent of rain-soaked earth. Puddles dotted the yard, reflecting fragments of blue sky. Elliot retrieved an old rake from the tool shed and began pulling dead leaves from Claire's garden beds. The wet foliage came away easily, revealing tender green shoots pushing through the dark soil. The screen door creaked, and Calvin's footsteps crossed the porch. He stood watching, coffee cup in hand, as Elliot worked methodically along the flower beds. Neither spoke for several minutes, letting the sounds of morning fill the space between them. Birds calling, the scratch of the rake against earth, the distant rumble of a neighbor's tractor. "You're up early," Calvin finally said, his voice careful, neutral. Elliot nodded without looking up. Garden needed attention. More silence followed, but it felt different than the tense quiet of previous days. This was the comfortable silence of shared understanding, of grief acknowledged but not consuming. Later, after Elliot had cleared 3 beds and straightened the border stones, he went inside and made breakfast. Real breakfast, not just coffee. He scrambled eggs with cheese, toasted bread, sliced an apple. Calvin watched with raised eyebrows as his brother ate everything on his plate. The morning stretched on, sunlight growing stronger as clouds dissipated. Around 10, Elliot walked out to the barn, its weathered red paint peeling in places, showing gray wood underneath. Calvin followed at a distance, curious. Inside, dust motes danced in the sunbeams that pierced through gaps in the walls. Old farm equipment, boxes of Claire's teaching supplies, and years of accumulated odds and ends filled the space. Elliot pulled out a small notebook from his back pocket and began sketching rough layouts, making notes in the margins. Calvin leaned against a support beam. "What are you thinking?" Elliot worked in silence for a few more minutes before looking up. His eyes were clear, focused. "I'm not selling," he said simply. "This place still has something to give." He turned the notebook so Calvin could see his sketches. Basic floor plans showing divided spaces, supply areas, recovery pens. "Not a full shelter," he explained. "Nothing official or public. Just a quiet place. For animals like Luna, ones that need somewhere safe, even if it's just for a little while. Calvin studied the drawings, then looked around the barn with new eyes. "It'll need work," he said carefully. "New wiring, better ventilation, proper drainage." "I know." Elliot ran his hand along a wooden beam. "But the structure's solid. Good bones," Dad always said. Calvin nodded slowly, understanding flowing between them. This wasn't just about the barn or animals. It was about purpose, about finding a way to honor both grief and hope, about creating something meaningful from loss. "The electrical will need to be completely redone," Calvin said, already mentally cataloging the work ahead. "And that roof section over there needs attention before winter." Elliot looked at his brother, really looked at him for the first time in days. "That mean you're staying? Someone has to make sure you don't electrocute yourself." Calvin's voice was gruff but warm. "Besides, I've got some vacation time saved up. Might as well use it." They stood together in the barn doorway, surveying the space that would become something new. Sunlight streamed in behind them, their shadows stretching long across the floor. The old wood felt warm under Elliot's palm as he ran his hand along the doorframe, remembering all the times it had opened and closed over the years. Calvin chuckled, breaking the moment. "You always sucked at wiring." A smile tugged at Elliot's lips, small but genuine. "That's why you're still here." The days began to blend together in a rhythm of work and quiet conversation. Each morning, Elliot would wake before sunrise, start the coffee maker, and spread out the rough sketches they'd made of the barn renovation on the kitchen table. Calvin would shuffle in minutes later, hair tousled, reaching for his mug without a word. The barn's transformation started slowly. On Friday, they tackled the overwhelming clutter first. Decades of accumulated tools, broken equipment, and mysterious boxes that hadn't been opened since their father's time. Each item they touched seemed to hold a memory. "Remember this?" Calvin held up a rusty fishing rod, its line long gone. "Dad tried to teach us both, but you were too busy reading about the fish instead of catching them." Elliot smiled, running his hand along the familiar grip. "I wanted to understand their migration patterns. You just wanted to show off." They worked steadily through the weekend, sorting what could be saved and hauling away what couldn't. The physical labor felt good, purposeful. By Sunday evening, the barn skeleton stood clean and ready for renewal. Monday brought the more technical work. Calvin, who'd picked up electrical skills during his college summers, installed new lighting, while Elliot replaced broken window panes. The fresh glass caught the sunlight differently, throwing prisms across the newly swept floor. "You're getting better at this," Calvin commented, watching Elliot carefully seal the edges of a window. "Remember when you tried to fix Mom's greenhouse? What a disaster." "That was 30 years ago," Elliot protested, but he was chuckling. "And as I recall, your solution was to cover the holes with duct tape. Hey, it held for a whole season." Their laughter echoed in the space, bouncing off the old beams in a way that made the barn feel alive again. During lunch breaks, they'd sit on the porch, sharing sandwiches and stories that hadn't been spoken in years. The silence between them grew comfortable rather than strained. On Tuesday, while installing new hinges on the barn door, Calvin suddenly spoke. "You know what always got to me?" He paused, adjusting his grip on the screwdriver. "How you could just be still. Even when everything was chaos, you'd find some quiet corner and make sense of it all. I never knew how to do that." Elliot looked at his brother, really looked at him, seeing past the sharp suits and practiced smirks to something more vulnerable. "It wasn't always easy," he admitted. "Sometimes the stillness was just me hiding." "Still," Calvin said softly, "you found something in it. Purpose, peace, Whatever it was, I envied that. Wednesday afternoon, while Calvin was measuring lumber for new stall partitions, a sound drifted through the barn's open doors. Hesitant at first, then growing stronger. Piano notes, slightly out of practice but intentional, floated from the house. Calvin set down his tape measure and walked to the doorway, leaning against the frame. The melody was simple, one their mother used to hum while gardening. He closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him. When he opened them again, they were damp, but his expression remained carefully neutral. The work continued through Thursday. They installed grain bins along the east wall, laid down rubber mats for comfort, and stacked fresh straw in the corner. Elliot ordered supplies online, basic medical equipment, feeding bottles, warm blankets. Each purchase felt like a promise. Their evening meals grew longer, more relaxed. They talked about their lives, Calvin's divorce 3 years ago, Elliot's struggles after Claire's passing. Words that had seemed impossible before flowed easier now, softened by shared purpose and physical exhaustion. "I should have been here," Calvin said Thursday night, staring into his coffee cup. "After Claire, I didn't know how to face it. Face you." "I know," Elliot replied simply. "But you're here now." Friday morning arrived with a gentle fog that slowly burned away as the sun rose. Calvin's duffel bag sat by the front door, his truck already running in the driveway. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small worn toolkit, their father's initials, R.H., still visible on the leather case. "Found this while cleaning," he said, holding it out. "Thought it might be useful here." Elliot took the kit, running his thumb over the faded letters. "Thanks, Cal." They stood awkwardly for a moment before Calvin stepped forward and pulled his brother into a brief but firm hug. When they separated, both men cleared their throats and looked away. "You'll let me know when the next goat shows up?" Calvin asked, reaching for his bag. Elliot grinned. "You'll be the first call." From the porch, Elliot watched the truck disappear down the gravel road, dust rising in its wake. The morning breeze tugged at his shirt, carrying the scent of fresh-cut wood and possibility. A gentle breeze rustled through the budding trees as Elliot Hayes made his way across the yard, his footsteps careful and measured. In his hands, he cradled a small wicker basket lined with soft cloth. Inside, barely larger than his thumb, lay a tiny yellow chick. Its downy feathers were patchy and dull, its breathing shallow but steady. The morning sun warmed his back as he walked, casting long shadows across the dewy grass. He'd found the chick earlier that morning, abandoned at the edge of his property. Something about its fragile determination to survive had touched him deeply. "Just hold on, little one," he murmured, adjusting the cloth to better shield it from the wind. The chick gave a weak peep in response, barely audible but present. As he approached the barn, Elliot couldn't help but marvel at its transformation. The weathered wood had been carefully restored, the roof patched and solid. New windows caught the morning light, making the interior glow warmly. Calvin's handiwork with the electrical system had given the space reliable power and proper lighting. It wasn't fancy or pristine, but it was exactly what it needed to be. The heavy door slid open smoothly on its track, no longer creaking like it used to. Elliot stepped inside, letting his eyes adjust to the filtered sunlight that streamed through the clean windows. The air was fresh and sweet with new hay, the space organized and peaceful. To his right, an old box turtle dozed in a specially built enclosure, its injured shell healing slowly but surely. Someone had abandoned it in a park last week, and the local ranger had brought it to Elliot. In a corner, a gray tabby cat lifted its head from its nest in the hay, regarding him with sleepy interest before settling back down. Its broken leg was nearly mended. Several small cages lined one wall, each holding a recovering bird, a robin with a wounded wing, two sparrows found after a storm. Their soft chirps created a gentle background chorus to the barn's quiet atmosphere. Elliot made his way to a clean workbench where he'd already prepared a box with a warming light. With gentle hands, he transferred the chick from the basket to its new temporary home, making sure the temperature was just right. The tiny creature huddled under the warmth, its eyes closing in apparent relief. "There you go," he said softly, adjusting the light's height. "Safe and warm now." Standing back, Elliot took in the scene before him. The barn had become exactly what he'd envisioned that day a month ago. Not a bustling shelter or a formal sanctuary, but a quiet haven for creatures who needed a gentle hand and a peaceful place to heal. Some stayed only days, others weeks, but each one mattered. His eyes drifted to the far wall where the photograph hung. The image captured Luna in a rare moment of joy. Front hooves lifted playfully off the ground, her small form backlit by sunshine. The picture had been taken just days before she passed, during that brief afternoon when she'd frolicked in the grass under supervision. Calvin had snapped it with his phone, catching her mid-prance. Below the photo, written in Elliot's steady hand on a simple card, were the words that had come to him late one night. "She wasn't mine to keep, just mine to love." The truth of those words settled deep in his chest. Luna's brief presence had changed everything, had shown him that love didn't have to be permanent to be meaningful, that sometimes the most important thing was simply being there, offering care without demanding forever. Standing beneath the photo now, hands tucked into his pockets, Elliot felt the familiar ache of missing her transform into something lighter. The pain hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted into purpose. Every animal that came through these doors carried a piece of Luna's legacy, the permission to love again, to care deeply, even knowing that goodbye would come. A soft chirp drew his attention back to the present. The baby chick had lifted its head slightly, responding to the warmth of the light. Elliot turned toward the sound, a smile touching his lips. The moment of reflection passed naturally into action as he reached for the eyedropper and carefully prepared the special formula the chick would need. The wind rustled through the trees outside, carrying with it the promise of spring. Inside the barn, the turtle shifted in its pen. The cat purred softly in its sleep, and the birds called quietly to each other. The baby chick chirped again, stronger this time. Elliot smiled and got to work. If you enjoyed the story of Elliot, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.